Okay, I'm back. I think I'm back. Let me type this in here. Okay, I'll send that out. Okay, here we go. And I am live. So I'm going to take it from the top again. I'm going to start by talking about the Canadian election. Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. Thank you all for hanging on. I appreciate it. So we have an election in Canada coming up on Monday. I haven't voted in a federal election since 1997, but I'm going to vote in this one. And the media has fallen down terribly in this election, as they do in every election. They can't be bothered doing any reporting, talking about issues. What they want to talk about is the polls. The polls do all the work for the media because the polls wonderfully tell us what the results of the election are going to be even before the election is called. And you can understand why the media likes that. At the beginning of the election, we were told that there's no point in voting for any other parties because Justin Trudeau's Liberals are going to win. The media had a scare at the midpoint of election as the Conservatives went ahead in the polls by 4 or 5%. And now in the home stretch, we've been told that there's really no point in voting for any other parties because Justin Trudeau's Liberals are going to win. It's just a question of how big a win they're going to get. Paul Wells in Maclean's writes, Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party of Canada appears poised to keep power after Monday's election, albeit with a reduced share of seats in the House of Commons, according to a seat projection prepared for Maclean's by the Innovative Research Group, a polling firm. The projection, based on party support in clusters of geographically or demographically similar seats, suggests the Liberals are poised to win about 148 seats, down from 157 of the 2019 election. Erin O'Toole's Conservatives would win approximately 112 seats, also down from 121 2019. The Bloc Québécois, under Yves-François Blanchet, would win 35 seats, up from 3 from the 2019 score, and the largest gains would be made by the NDP, which is on track to win about 42 seats, up from 24 in 2019, and just shy of the 44 seats Tom Mulcair's NDP won in 2015. And there is a big issue that has not been discussed in this election because the media is lazy, and it's a forbidden topic in my country, which is immigration. Canada has been radically transformed by immigration since 1967, and this radical transformation continues. But no, Canada is to be subject to the Great Replacement, which isn't happening, but that's a good thing that it is happening. Herb Grubel, who I have met, former economics professor, Simon Fraser University, former Reform Party MP, who is honest as the day is long, who has produced many valuable studies on the economic consequences of immigration in Canada. They're not good. For all the talk about immigrants being such great entrepreneurs, they take far more out than they give in, and this gets worse over succeeding generations. Grubel had a piece in the Financial Post, which is very rare. The Financial Post is part of the National Post, that they do not like to talk about immigration, probably not least because the National Post was one of the biggest beneficiaries of the $595 million that Trudeau paid, a couple of years ago to keep the media sweet. And the National Post pretends it's a Canadian paper, but it is owned by an American hedge fund. At any rate, Grubel wrote, the Trudeau government is on record that it will increase the number of immigrants from 300,000 in 2018 to 411,000 in 2022. These don't sound like large numbers, but keep in mind there are only 38 million people in Canada. This increase will have serious implications for the three hot-button issues of the 2020 election: the high cost of housing, the inadequate capacity of medical and other public facilities, and climate change. Yet in their campaign documents, none of the three major parties discusses the effects of immigration on these issues or promises to change existing immigration levels or policies. Canadians deserve better. The effects of immigrants on the cost of housing are obvious. After arriving in Canada, people must live somewhere. Thus, they add to the demand for housing, and other things being equal, the excess of demand over supply. In recent years, that excess demand has significantly raised the already high inflation-adjusted prices of single-family homes, condominiums, and apartments. These high prices have motivated the major parties to promise policies to increase supply through the financial encouragement of construction or outright government ownership of rental facilities. Though such policies have been promised in the past, the record shows that they have proved inadequate. Because the need for new construction is currently much larger than the ability of governments to finance it, current promises are likely to face the same fate. Another set of policies promised by the three leading parties involves reductions in the demand for housing. The cheapest and most risk-free proposal sees the imposition of restrictions on the purchases of dwellings by foreigners. Many Canadians applaud this idea, and foreigners have no political clout to oppose it. But even if the policy did stop foreign purchases, the effect on prices would be minimal because demand from foreigners makes up only a small proportion of the total. Moreover, to realize speculative or investment profits, foreigners have to sell dwellings, so that in effect they raise prices when they buy and lower them when they sell. And of course, Liberal proposals to provide subsidies to new home buyers will increase demand, possibly by more than restrictions on foreign ownership will reduce it. The reality is that almost all demand for housing is caused by population growth, of which in recent years immigration has accounted for about 80%. It is hardly rocket science that reducing the number of future immigrants would reduce demand and help bring it in line with supply. Immigrants also add to the excess demand for medical services, whose existing supply cannot prevent both long waiting lists and sometimes acute shortages of both hospital beds and family physicians. Newcomers also cause excess demand for roads, public transit, and recreation facilities, which results in traffic congestion as well as overcrowding on buses and in public parks. Those currently running for office promise to alleviate these problems with increased spending on healthcare and infrastructure. But such promises are likely to produce the same results as similar ones made in past elections. Some new facilities will be created, but at best they will enable supply to keep up only with the natural increase in population, the rise in income, and the overall aging of the population, but not with the demand created by the much larger number of immigrants. The negative effects immigrants have on the affordability of housing, the availability of public services, and the cost of climate change policies could be reduced by lowering immigration to 100,000 a year, a number I believe would allow ample numbers of skilled workers and refugees alike to meet both our labor market needs and our international humanitarian responsibilities. The proposed number can readily be raised or lower if evidence suggests that demand or cyclical economic conditions warrant it, or supplies of housing and public facilities have caught up with demand. Of course, a question not answered in Grubel's otherwise excellent essay is, how big do we want our cities to become? How crowded do we want our lives to be? Immigration moratorium is what Canada needs, and practically, 10,000 people a year. We can make room for, Nobel Prize winners, say, if they want to move here. But as far as skilled workers, there is no reason whatsoever that we cannot train Canadians for shortages in certain areas. Business wants lots of immigrants because, they raise consumption and they lower wages. And of course, the Liberals and the NDP want more immigrants because immigrants vote for the Liberals and the NDP. As for old stock Canadians, they don't even get a look in. Brian Mulroney, who was arguably the worst prime minister in Canadian history until Justin Trudeau, he wants more people in Canada. 100 million by 2100. Of course, if that were to come about, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and other cities would be as crowded or more as Hong Kong. Do we want to live in Hong Kong? I don't want to live in Hong Kong. And of course, Justin Trudeau and the like, they're never going to live in Hong Kong. They will live in, pleasant enclaves. They will live in single family dwellings, but the single family dwelling is becoming effectively unaffordable for the Canadian middle class, if indeed a Canadian middle class can even be said to exist. And I should mention that Erin O'Toole, the Conservative Party leader, is telling people not to split the vote, the right-wing vote. Well, that's begging the question, because the Conservative Party of Canada is not conservative in any sense. It is not right-wing in any sense. Erin O'Toole wants to spend, extra $103 billion. He wants to bust the bank, but just in a slightly different way than Justin Trudeau. Erin O'Toole has no problem at all with the Great Replacement. In fact, he welcomes it. Erin O'Toole, like Justin Trudeau, is in favor of the de facto decriminalization of all drugs, including heroin, which is already the case in Canada. The Canadian government hands out free top quality heroin to people, even as fatal drug overdoses continue to explode. The solution to people dying of drugs, apparently, is to give them more drugs. The Conservative Party of Canada has actually, there's been a longstanding campaign by gay PR spivs to take over the party, and the gay PR spivs have won. So Erin O'Toole is actually to the left of the Liberals. He wants homosexuals to be able to donate blood at any time without any restrictions, despite the fact that the last time that this was tried, it led to disaster and quite a few dead people. And it led to the Canadian Red Cross being stripped of its control over the Canadian blood supply. And Erin O'Toole's party, at least Michelle Rempel, wants to legalize poppers. So to make buggery less painful from homosexuals, poppers are extremely noxious drug, but never mind that. We don't have anything against drugs of any kind now in Canada, apparently. Canada of 100 million people, or Canada of even 45, 50 million people. What's that going to be like? Well, Lamprey Milt has a piece in the American Sun, September the 15th, called Density Intensity. It's no secret that crowds are bad. There was a time not long ago when politicians, environmentalists, engineers, ethnologists, and biologists warned of what high density does to humans. They asserted correlations of density to anxiety, tension, divorce, paranoia, neurosis, stampedes, schizophrenia, rape, murder, and even war. It's truly an amazing feat. After centuries of having this knowledge, we still live under these conditions, and I expect it to get much worse. And then he talks about Pol Pot and the war of the country on the city. And then let's go back to the Communist Manifesto and read plank number 9. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. Translation circa 2021, redistribution of peoples over existing communities, thus causing metropolitan suburban areas to become more densely populated and indistinctive. The lockdowns didn't stop the spread of the virus. What it did was trap poor and middle-class residents in urban areas while the ultra-wealthy fled. It was quite ominous a few months into the well, I'm not going to use this word, to notice the number of private helicopters flying over my house, transporting the managerial class to and from the Hamptons and Manhattan. Those on this side of politics must realize that the key is not to disturb the balance, with the COVID lockdown being an accelerant, causing a knock-on effect to achieve their long-term goals. What you are seeing is a battle between communists and the neoliberal death machine. Between ongoing unrest, proxy wars, lockdowns, etc., it hasn't disrupted the system, and all of this can be seen as an economic stress test and another tool in the chest of anthropological weapons. No black swan, food still abundant, though choices will become limited soon. Goods and services still available, but at limited capacity, lumber, appliances, social services. The rulers cannot afford something catastrophic, as this may actually cause some kind of autonomy for a region or community. Demographers were fully aware a century ago of what the population was going to be by the turn of the century and theorized how to manage the situation. When nations as a whole decline in power, it gives rise to the megacities as centers of power and multinational corporations being the combatants until achieving perfect competition. This meaning that there is little to distinguish a Cadillac to a Lincoln or Costco from Walmart, so on and so forth. These business models lack innovation, their products are interchangeable, and marginal profits reach almost zero. Each megacity being specialized in specific industry. Examples are some of the most obvious, like New York City and Charlotte for banks, LA for entertainment, and lesser known like Cincinnati being a hub for insurance and St. Louis for processed foods. The merger of Polis with Cosmos was the idea the city was to be used as a vehicle to connect people with the heavens. The city is not a civilization, but rather the material accretion of wealth that comes before the end. It's the ossification of once were great ideas of a polyglot identity. Cities are a byproduct of the prosperity of a nation. As the countryside flourished in its dynamic agrarian principles and industrialization, the city became the destination for schools, arts, banks, and anything part of transactional economics. They benefited from the need of information and coordination of both service and finances in a globalized economy. Knowledge-based industries have led to the Renaissance man's death and gave rise to the one-trick pony expert. Eventually, the countryside is depleted of fresh human capital for a wide variety of reasons and begins to decline in political influence from depopulation. In the third world, people between the ages of 20 to 50 work in the urban centers and send money to their children and parents in the countryside for basic necessities. If things go sideways for them in the city, they can always go back home, tend to their land, and be with their families without the worries of property taxes and mortgages. In the United States, we are being killed off via elegant extinction because we forgot some basic rules and reproduction societal principles. And since we are reproducing, we must bring in fresh bodies from other continents to pledge allegiance to GDP. Death rates have always been higher in urban areas than in rural areas, and birth rates have always been higher in the countryside until recently. Cities need to keep growing because their political influence depends on human capital. The more people a city has, the more votes it commands, the more money it gets, and the fewer jobs a city has to offer, thus more people becoming dependent on the system fueling government largesse. This is called plutonomy, or an economic model based on a wealthy class investing and spending while subsidizing immigrants and the impoverished who will vote to ensure the elites retain power. Trained people will be the managerial class overseeing the plantation of mystery meat serfs, who will be well regulated to workfare and will stagnate inside the city centers. How many craft beer joints and cheese boutiques can one city handle? Let us understand the concept of hotel living, elegant extinction, and some other ideas that are floating around in the direction we are going. This is the subscription-based boutique economy with the Taco Bell infrastructure. Does anyone notice the trend of the mergers of hotels and condominiums and the mixed-use luxury apartments popping up? The city is filled with aspiring people, but few get to fulfill their dreams. Even today, despite its futuristic dystopia, nurses and doctors flock to mega regions to help fight the pandemic. Young professionals who've been renting for years on end are now thrilled to buy a micro apartment, even though a flasher lives in the playground across the street and anti-maskers get maced by the police. Dog walkers, baristas, refrigerator art artists, insta-thought influencers, and those alike are all to serve, or should I say serve, to the managerial class who adhere to the woke elite. Repurpose the old industrial buildings into cafe shops, gay discos, artisanal cheese boutiques, breweries, co-working spaces, transactional services like insurance banks and telecom stores. The push for building casinos in blighted areas giving the press lip service that it's job creation and union construction workers lobby for such products. Churches are gutted and turned into nightclubs or high-end condos with never-ending amenities. The idea has been that the city inhabitant can live every day like a tourist, perpetuated by Hollywood movies. Municipality planners discuss how there will be local vibrancy of small shop owners and gives the average person the illusion of something long forgotten and provokes nostalgia, but this could not be further from the truth. Instead, what we get is long malls of multinational brands with the likes of Starbucks, Coach, Pizza Hut, Walgreens, Subways, and Allstate Insurance. This gives rise to the Pokemon metropolis, where people see the aesthetics of vibrancy and bustling shops and traffic and conflate it with economic growth. Mumbai streets are chaotic, but in the end is not economically competitive, nor is New York City or San Francisco at this point. What about your historic downtown? In places like Asheville, North Carolina, which is referred to the East Coast, Portland has an obscene 78 hotels already operating with an additional 500 more units to go online. Asheville's population sits under 100,000 and has very little to offer as far as job opportunities go, and is the quintessential monotonic prototype of what we may see copied across mid-sized cities far inland. This prototype of gentrification a la carte of gays, trustafarians, service-based economy workers, tourism, abcab, and adjunct poverty, with powerful old money business owners dictating local policy. It's unfortunate that as the young flee areas of such wealth disparity, their parents are right behind them with good credit and large down payments. As the rise of singles and decline of family formation, more people in the short term will demand space, which is the opposite from what we would expect. A baboon logic of if I have space, I will look more attractive to mates, or more room means more space for children or dogs. As more people demand space, it puts pressure on detached housing. Those with this mindset are not considering the transient nature of the workplace taxes and general upkeep of their property. Reality will set in and they will be forced to liquidate their property. In Vermont, households of one or two people have continued to grow, comprising a hair-raising 69% of all households as of 2017. Meanwhile, households with three or more plummet. With such a growing demographic coupled with falling wages and inflation, their disposable incomes and savings go into Airbnbs, seasonal homes, and other forms of passive rental incomes. As of July 2019, there were 8,041 homes listed as short-term Airbnb-style rentals in Vermont, and 85% of the state's growth is concentrated in Chittenden County, which is Vermont's most populated county. With murky data due to COVID, it doesn't take much stretch of the imagination on thinking about how many rooms are rented out with shared living spaces because of the diaspora out of blue hives and people working remotely. All it does is hurt those trying to leave. I would not be surprised if there will be tax break incentive to sponsor a family of refugees or some sort of fines levied on those who do not occupy second homes. We are already seeing increases on taxes via reassessment, which will be the key in driving people out of their houses, and worse is to come. And the worst that is to come, that which is described by Lamprey Mill, is endorsed in my country by the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, the NDP Party, and I suppose every party except the People's Party of Canada. You will live in a pod, you will own nothing, and you will like it. That is the future that Canada has apparently chosen. That may seem like too harsh a judgment, because when the media, when the elite tells them there is no alternative, well, people get used to that. And I suppose a lot of people in Canada are thinking, well, you know, I'm going to be dead in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. There's nothing I can do about it. So probably best to just stop thinking about it. Let's go to the chat. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Again, apologies for what happened. Apparently, I'd opened dual streams because cleaning the cache, I had shut down Google, but it was still there on my screen. And when I went live, it created a duplicate stream, and it took me forever to figure out how I couldn't shut it off. I eventually had to delete it which is something I've never done before, but never mind. Hello to Urban Planner, Tricky Who, David Wright, Ann Run, Brandon Smith, Dan, Kontiki Roulette, Dibareus, Belcaso 88. Brandon Smith says, I love it when elections render unto the voter what deserves the voter. Dibareus says, I am hearing PPC at over 12%. Is that even possible? Well, poll last week showed them at 11%. Now they're at half of that. Whether there's any jiggery pokery involved here, I can't say. I suspect it. I suspected. Brandon Smith says, I remember the 2016 U.S. polls. That's true enough. Hello to William Hicks, Brandon Smith, Steve Half Galician, Kontiki Roulette, Gamion. Brandon Smith says, I live in a tax farm run by megalomaniacs. Justin Proto said, we used to buy 40s before concerts when I was 15. I can't imagine that these days. Kontiki Roulette says, the last 18 months have taught me that we live in a multiverse. I have no desire to influence people who live in a different reality. Jason Bryan likes my tie. Chokakin 666, also no Splenda or Sweet and Low. Supply chain effed up, sugar running low at Starbucks. You know, I've been extolling the virtues of zinc for years. I am not a doctor. I have no medical credentials. But I started taking zinc for a different reason in the middle 90s. And I discovered that since I started taking zinc, I no longer got colds or the flu. Make of that what you will. Other people have reported the same. But I went to buy zinc this week because I had run out, and I found out that the price of zinc has pretty much tripled over the last 3 months. Two reasons for that, I suppose. That zinc has become very popular due to COVID, but also supply chain problems. Popcasso 88 says 100,000 is 99,000 too many. I agree. Hello to Red Sulfur. Nothing we can do except internal exile. That's a phrase, internal exile is a phrase which became popular among a certain class of people in the days of the Soviet Union. Yes, I am forced to live here, but in my head, I live somewhere else. Elections are useless. Well, in my country, the anarchist saying is absolutely true. If elections could change anything, they would be illegal. David Wright says old stock Canadians are gone like Wayne and Schuster. That takes me back. When I was in the 6th grade, I co-wrote and directed a play. It was called Uncle Lenny's Happy Hour. It was a parody of a show for kiddies. We won an award from Channel 8. All of the jokes, with very few exceptions, were simply stolen from George Carlin. That's before, he became the profane comedian, and Wayne and Schuster. Red Sulfur says the Solzhenitsyn Benedictine option. Brandon Smith says giving them free drugs isn't going far enough. David Wright said took a train ride from Windsor to Toronto in less than 5 hours. Oh, are people commuting to Toronto from Windsor now? I wouldn't be surprised. Steve says poppers will be mentioned at least 3 times per stream. Jalapeno popper, says David Wright. Popcasso 8 says that's taking the slow route via Kitchener. Via takes 3 hours. Well, maybe people are commuting. Brandon Smith mentions my South Park tie. Okay, who else do we have? Steve says urbanization has been a global trend for the last 2 centuries at least. Yes, but of course the dream was the single-family home. The dream was a 1-story or a 2-story detached dwelling. Now we are told, no. Don't you know about the future? Don't you know about globalization? It's history. It's science. It's ineluctable. Again, you will live in a pod. You will own nothing, and you will like it. Streaming. We've got to stream everything. DVDs, Blu-rays, CDs. Those are for losers. Those are for suckers. What decade do you live in? Or what century do you live in? The propaganda, and Steve Jobs was at the head of this, the propaganda has been assailing us for, 20 years now. Owning things? Why would you want to own anything? Actually, people like owning things. It carves out a little world for them, but we're being told that everything you need in life is on here. That's all you need. And if you want more than what's on here, you are asking too much, that you are, antisocial, perhaps. There is something wrong with you. Let's see. Steve says, far-fetched. Our navies melt away on dune and headland, sinks the fire. Hello, Kyle Free and David the Gnome. Babylon has fallen to rise no more, he says. Seraphim Goose says the last 2 centuries, gayest centuries to date. Well, homosexuals as a rule do not produce children. And so they are better than us. Since they don't produce children, and since that is the desired mode, obviously transsexuals are, male to female or female to male, they're not going to produce children either. All the better for us to import dusky foreigners, the new helot class. Chogokin 666 says, crow befriended me today. I'm not fond of crows myself. I'm rather afraid of them after several incidents. Visionary Companion says, all the bus stops in Seattle look like a whale corpse exploded in the vicinity. The Right Honorable says, you will own a device which instructs you on how to think and literally nothing else. Gamion says, Amazon doesn't let me read an ebook on both my Kindles, wants me to buy a second copy, $50. I hate Amazon. Couldn't you use a conversion program like Caliber, which is free? Red Sulfur says, we do not take a siesta outdoors when crows are around. No Sleep Till Breezewood PA says, one day I will return to dumb phones as I try to watch Kevin using ham radios. Visionary Companion says, I always balked at liking the Breeders because of the name. I listened to the whole of their hit record, their second record, and I liked it then, and I like it now. Okay, so let's move from Canada to the United States. And yes, something going on, something big, well, several big things going on. Jim Kunstler writes today, like the white whale of legend surfacing close to the mainland, Special Counsel John Durham popped up this week with one Michael Sussman in his jaws, the smallest fish among the squamous and tentacled monsters hiding in the depths of the deep state below the raging political seas. Who he, anyway? Among the now well-known cast of creatures involved in the panoramic episode of perfidious sedition known as Russiagate, Sussman was a bit player, an errand boy for the Perkins Coie law firm that did much of Hillary Clinton's dirty work in the 2016 campaign and for the Democratic Party beyond. Sussman is charged with lying to the FBI and conveying campaign dirt paid for by Clinton to the FBI's general counsel, James Baker, Sussman's old colleague from the days when he worked as a cybersecurity expert at the Bureau. He also peddled around the same material cooked up by Glenn Simpson's Fusion GPS company and man of mystery Christopher Steele to the New York Times and other news media who ran with it like kids with a kite. I have a theory about the case, Kunstler writes. It is shot across the bow of Attorney General Merrick Garland's ship, testing whether Maine DOJ will attempt to interfere with Durham's mission to uncover the predicates of Russiagate and the vast web of dishonest and illegal acts carried out subsequently by figures in the FBI, DOJ, and other dark corners of a government gone rogue against its own citizens. Baker has long been suspected of acting as a cooperating witness in the Russiagate matter, perhaps realizing early on that he'd been played by old pal Sussman and set up for prosecution. The problem for Merrick Garland is that Sussman's activities amounted to a mere preface for the graver development of the Crossfire Hurricane operation. I'll just break into say Crossfire Hurricane is, of course, a line from the Rolling Stones song Jumpin' Jack Flash. That's how cool these deep state operatives thought they were. Operation Crossfire Hurricane involved a shoal of much bigger fish across several agencies, including directors John Brennan of the CIA and James Comey of the FBI, and many others. The Sussman indictment also provides a window into the FISA court fakery that federal law enforcement used to go after people connected to candidate and then President Donald Trump. Yes, and a story from the Federalist. FISA court confirms the government lied in every single spy warrant application against Carter Page. Anyone going to go to prison for that? Counselor continues, Garland will be left having to explain why the DOJ and FBI were never self-accountable for the illegal acts of their employees, including Robert Mueller's fishy special counsel team, which now looks like a cover-up operation, not to mention current and continuing matters, such as the DOJ sitting on the laptop of President Joe Biden's son, Hunter, and its bales of incriminating memoranda detailing payoffs to the Biden family from companies run by the CCP. Really, the fate of the Democratic Party is on the line with what might potentially develop if Durham's actions go beyond Sussman's little caper. The overwhelming body of opinion for more than a year is that Durham is a phantom doing next to nothing about the greatest political scandal in U.S. history. If his efforts end with Sussman, he will disgrace himself, of course, and that's a possibility. But I would venture to suppose that it won't end there. The insult to the nation of all the epic dishonesty is too grave, even potentially fatal, since it has enabled a depraved skein of additional seditious activities afterwards, including the 2020 election subterfuge, the lawlessness of Black Lives Matter and Antifa, the psychotic race and gender woke mind effery infecting the U.S. military, the ongoing invasion across the U.S.-Mexican border, all the coercion around COVID-19, especially mandated shots of the dangerous so-called vaccine, and the destruction of small business from sea to shining sea. All this has left the American public demoralized and economically savaged, and with the country standing in the world dangerously reduced. I hope you are ready, concludes, for a month of shocks to the system. The deceit of the CDC and the FDA in gaming and cooking their COVID-19 data is now emerging from the fog of pandemic hysteria. I will also dare to conjecture that the number of recent and current COVID-19 cases turns out to be actually an overwhelmingly adverse reactions to the mRNA experiment, not the disease itself, and holy hell will erupt among the public as it becomes understood that their livelihoods and their health are being stolen as part of this fraud. A week from today, the Arizona election audit results are now scheduled to be released. Expect trauma. Tomorrow, a demonstration in support of the 1-6 political prisoners is on board for Washington, D.C. The potential for deep state manipulation of the event is high, so stay away from it. There are enough other forces in motion now to throw a spanner in the engine of malice our government has become. Let karma do its thing and hold on tight for a rough ride. This is from AP News. The top U.S. military officer said Friday that calls he made to his Chinese counterpart in the final stormy months of Donald Trump's presidency were, quote, perfectly within the duties and responsibilities, unquote, of his job. Yes, to let China know what the American military is doing, and to let China know that the President of the United States is not in charge of America's military arsenal. Milley is. Yes, he's perfectly within the duties and responsibilities of his job. Who died and made him the military dictator of the United States? In his first public comments on the conversations, General Mark Milley said such calls are routine. Are they now? And were done to reassure both allies and adversaries, in this case, in order to ensure strategic stability. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff spoke to AP and another reporter traveling with him to Europe. Again, I've been predicting this since 2017. And this is one of the predictions that I make. Well, it was a joke, really. A joke in the form of a prediction, which I desperately wanted to not come true, but it appeared that it has come true. that the U.S. military, or the top echelons of the U.S. military, were planning to remake the book and the movie 7 Days in May, only this time the traitors are the heroes. This is from Missy Ryan at the Washington Post. New revelations showing how General Mark Milley, the nation's top military officer, quietly maneuvered to check President Donald Trump, reveal the lengths the top officials went to prevent potentially rash action, but the disclosures also threatened to thrust the military deeper into the partisan fray, former officials said. A series of dramatic inside-the-room accounts, including one in which the chairman of the Joint Chiefs promised to alert China's top officer if Trump was preparing to launch an attack, provides new insight into the military leader's response to the previous administration's fraught final period. But Corey Sheikh, a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, said the revelations that Milley covertly acted to counter his commander-in-chief are, quote, bad for the military as an institution. It encourages people to do what Americans are already doing, which is viewing the military as they view the Supreme Court, apolitical when they agree with them, partisan when they don't, unquote. Oh, this is a Reichstag moment, Milley told others, referring to the 1933 attack on the German parliament. The book reported the gospel of the Führer. You know, you throw this word Reichstag around, and Milley is too dim-witted to understand that this is a coup. You talk about Reichstag, and you mean a coup. But again, since General Milley is so very woke, a military takeover of the United States can be nothing but a good thing. Peter Fever, a scholar on civil military relations at Duke University, said he's been asked, that's Milley, to do the most difficult Olympic dive of any chairman since Goldwater Nichols. A 1986 congressional act that cemented the power of the top officer. So when you're evaluating the quality of the dive and evaluating him, you have to recognize that. What's with all the metaphors here? Huh? Really? This is a military takeover of the U.S. government. So let's have this elongated metaphor about Olympic diving. Milley did what he had to do to fulfill his oath to the Constitution and protect this country, a senior military official said, speaking on the condition of anonymity because he was not authorized to speak on the record. It's a great concern, says John Gans, a former Pentagon speechwriter. This won't end well. The Washington Post couldn't find anyone to say, what the hell is going on here? How can this stand? Apparently not. Apparently not. As a piece, okay, that is old news. Now, let's talk about corruption. Well, military corruption, foreign policy corruption, and business corruption. Helen Andrews in the American Conservative, and anything by Helen Andrews is worth reading, especially her book, Boomers. She reviews a book, The Key Man, How the Global Elite Was Duped by a Capitalist Fairy Tale by Simon Clark and Will Lausch. She begins, no one wants to admit knowing Arif Nakvi these days, now that he is under house arrest in London, awaiting extradition to the United States after having paid the highest bail in British history, £15 million. But just a few years ago, he was the perfect emblem of an era. Nakvi was founder and CEO of the Abraj Group, a private equity firm based in Dubai that one sympathetic journalist called the go-to private equity firm for outreach to Muslim nations. Outreach, yes. Pallets of $100 bills being delivered. That's what they consider outreach. When President Obama announced a new fund to support technological development in Muslim-majority countries in his famous Cairo speech in 2009, Abraj was among the firms chosen to distribute hundreds of millions of dollars. Nakvi was a regular at Davos, a guest at the White House, a recipient of 9-figure checks from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Abraj's attraction for Western leaders is summed up in the subtitle of this new book by two Wall Street Journal journalists who helped chronicle the firm's downfall. The market has been the most powerful force the world has ever known for creating opportunity and lifting people out of poverty, Obama told Muslim business leaders at a summit on entrepreneurship held after his Cairo speech. Nakvi spoke a few minutes later and echoed the same message. The third world's problems would be solved not by government, but by capitalism. Prosperity was the solution to everything from women's rights to terrorism. How's that worked out in China, by the way? Because we were all assured, if you're old enough to remember this, going back to the 1990s, that we get China, into the world trade system. We integrate them, and then the communist dictatorship will wither away, to quote Marx. They'll be just like us. Strangely, that hasn't happened, and China has become much more dictatorial since it was allowed to tap in to the world trade system. Abraj was able to win so many highly placed supporters and still has his defenders today because his business model made sense. It was the firm that could translate first world business standards into third world practice. The rising middle class of Asia and Africa is promising territory for Western businessmen, but as the saying goes, the smartest investor in New York can be the dumbest investor in Nairobi if he doesn't understand how things work there. There's a Adam Curtis documentary, one of his earlier ones, which is absolutely hilarious, and it deals with British businessmen doing business in Saudi Arabia, going back to the 1960s, and there's a problem with doing business with Arabians in Saudi Arabia is that they do not understand time the way we do. I'm not making this up. You can look this up. When someone from Saudi Arabia tells you that he's going to meet you at such and such a time, frequently you have no idea what he means by that. Seems to me that would make it rather difficult to conduct business with such people. Helen Andrews continues, the way Abraj bridged this gap can be seen in one of its success stories, Karachi Electric. Pakistan's former capital was known as the City of Lights when Nakvi was born there in 1960. By the time he returned to buy its recently privatized electricity company in 2009, the name was ironic. Power outages were frequent, customers refused to pay their bills, the workforce was apathetic and corrupt, and a third of the city's electricity was siphoned off, either by individuals or by gangs selling the power for their own profit. A team of Germans from Siemens was brought in to modernize Karachi Electric in 2005. But they added technological improvements without fixing the underlying problems, and the company's losses doubled. It's easy to see why the Germans failed. Whenever employees heard rumors of impending layoffs, they would rampage through the company's headquarters, loot its offices, and fire guns at senior executives. When non-paying neighborhoods had their service cut off, residents would riot, blockade streets, besiege the company's field offices, and set its repair vans on fire. This kind of behavior was outside the German manager's comfort zone. Yes, translation, everyone in the world is not like us. Andrews writes, but if Abraj was a bridge between first world rectitude and third world corruption, the traffic went in both directions. Of course. A basic pillar of Navki's business strategy was hiring well-connected people to gain access to elite circles. The son of the Malaysian Prime Minister, a nephew of the King of Jordan, the daughter of Sri Lankan hedge fund tycoon Rajar Ratnam were all on Abraj's payroll and helped smooth his operations in regions where families had influence. Nakvi continued to use nepotism as a tactic in the American arena. He hired Wahid Hamid, President Obama's old roommate from Occidental College, and Pradeep Ramamurthy, a White House official who helped draft the Cairo speech. When John Kerry needed a place to hang his hat after leaving the State Department, Abraj offered him a salaried role, which he eventually declined, although he did accept a $250,000 speaking fee. Globetrotting McKinsey alum Kito DeBoer, who succeeded Tony Blair as head of the UN-sponsored Palestinian Development Organization, the Quartet, was hired by Abraj at a six-figure salary in 2017, shortly before things went sideways. Well, yes, doing well by doing good, as they say, and there's much more at the American conservative Helen Edwards corruption in elite places. So what do we have from Drudge? General Field feared dementing Donald. You see the projection here. Joe Biden is the one who's, oh no, but no, we're concerned about Donald Trump. Donald Trump may be a hasty man. He may be a hostile man, but who doubts his basic sanity or the fact that, he's a compos mentis. Fed officials own securities it was buying during pandemic. More and more questions about conflict surrounded by controversy. Why did agency pump up Apple? Federal Reserve buys bonds of Apple, Verizon, and others. Apple and Verizon bonds are among those bought by the Federal Reserve in the agency's effort to support the corporate debt market. Yes, it's all for the 1%. This is from a Timcast. The irony surrounding the Met Ball appearance of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just won't quit. It turns out that AOC attended the $35,000 per ticket gala with billionaire Seagram's heir Benjamin Bronfman, who was dating the tax-the-rich dress designer Aurora James. As the masked working class catered to the unmasked elite at the event, the Congresswoman was partying it up with Bronfman, who lives in a $7 million mansion on the Upper West Side and whose family is worth an estimated $2.5 billion. Let's see, what do we know about this Benjamin Bronfman fellow? I'm just going to look him up here. Oh, he's an American entrepreneur and musician. Oh, yes, I was right about this. He and musician and activist Mathanga Maya Arul Pragasam, better known under the stage name MIA, were engaged in 2009 to 2012 and have a son together. MIA was recently given, a CBE, OBE, or something like this, MBE, despite being a long supporter of terrorism, Tamil terrorism, and other forms of terrorism, because I guess she's moved on from England to the United States, which is a good thing for England, but not a good thing for the United States. Matt Stoller, whose book on monopoly I reviewed on the book club and quite like, has a Substack. All the top people are on Substack now. His book is called Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly, Power, and Democracy. And he writes, Counterfeit Capitalism, Why a Monopolized Economy Leads to Inflation and Shortages. From railroads to plastic bags to semiconductors to ice cream, Wall Street and monopolists are creating shortages and exploiting them. I've lived in Washington, D.C. for 15 years, Stoller writes, and one of the many unacknowledged changes has been the disappearance of taxis. While the city has good public transportation, when it's not broken down, you could jump into a taxi for a reasonably priced, convenient ride around commercial areas. Around 2012, Uber and Lyft came into the market, and for the next 7 years, it got even better, with cheaper Uber fares within minutes. At the time, everyone knew that Uber and its tech economy cousins were heavily subsidized by investors, with Uber losing up to $1 million a week, but the cheap rides were too good a deal to pass up. It couldn't last forever, and it didn't. Slowly, cabs under pressure from rideshares disappeared. Taxis had been a reasonable business in DC, and the drivers had middle-class lifestyles, but there was a tipping point, and the industry collapsed. Similarly, driving for Uber, once a reasonable side job, became worse as the firm cut the amount paid to drivers. Now cabs are mostly gone. And today, rideshares are often a 10 to 20-minute wait and more expensive. It's not just a DC problem. Nationally, Uber Lyft prices up 92% over the last year and a half. At least in Washington, cabs, although they could now go back to their previous pricing, have not returned. In other words, there is both inflation and in some ways a shortage of taxi services. Professional class people not being able to cheaply zip around is not the biggest problem in the world, but the story I just told you about why that service shriveled isn't an isolated incident. While once rideshares were plentiful, now they are not. Would-be monopolists both raise prices to consumers, cut wages to drivers, and reduce the amount of driving services available in general. And this story brings us to the problem of shortages and inflation. Last February, before COVID hit in force, I predicted in Wired magazine that this pandemic would introduce us to the problem of shortages. And now, almost every week, I get emails from readers complaining about not being able to buy things they need. Politicians I know are hearing about it on the campaign trail. If you talk to local economic development officials, they will note that both shortages of goods and labor are the top concern of most businesses at this point. Reddit has a subreddit dedicated to shortages. The most recent Federal Reserve Beige Book mentions shortage 80 times. Even CNN is covering the problem, noting that shipping boxes have doubled in price and the cost of moving goods from East Asia to the US or Europe has gone up fivefold. And he links to a tweet from Sam Howard. Friends, the whole supply chain is a mess. If there is any book you desperately want a physical edition of pre-holidays, please, please, please pre-order it as soon as possible and from an indie bookstore so that we accurately measure demand and print enough books. It is a mess. This from Lorraine. This week it was cat food, entire shelf empty, bleach, whole shelf, no Pepto-Bismol in any form, and a fourth shelf, but I don't remember what was normally on it. I remember looking at it and thinking, is this a sign to come? That's from September the 11th. Stoller writes, there are shortages in everything from ocean shipping containers to chlorine tablets to railroad capacity to black pipe, the piping that houses wires inside building, to spicy chicken breast to specialized plastic bags necessary for making vaccines. Moreover, prices for all sorts of items, from housing to food, are changing in weird ways. Beef, for instance, is at near record highs for consumers, but cattle ranchers are getting paid much less than they used to for their cows. Golly, it's funny how that works, isn't it? It's as if the globalists decided, what, with Biden in power, there is no stopping us. We can grind the middle class into dust and get richer thereby. Sorab Almari writes in the New York Post, America's high-tech tyranny is far more sophisticated than Putin's crude autocracy. On Monday, the Central Election Commission of the Russian Federation dismissed a complaint lodged by local pro-democracy activists concerning the government's decision to censor a news story on corruption in the Putin clan just ahead of the 2018 presidential election in the autocratic nation. Published in the reformist newspaper Novaya Gazeta, the story had detailed how the Russian strongman's daughter Katerina helped arrange meetings between a German appliances giant seeking market share in Russia and her father while he served as prime minister in 2011. Soon after the story's appearance, the popular Russian social media platform VK moved to ban it, going so far as to prevent Russian users from sharing it in direct messages and suspending Novaya Gazeta's account. Senior members of the Russian security apparatus denounced the story as U.S. misinformation, although they admitted they had no direct evidence of American involvement. The Election Commission's decision, made last month behind closed doors and set to become public soon, concluded that VK had credibly explained that blocking the article's distribution was a merely commercial decision, and that the move followed existing policies related to hacked materials according to factual and legal analysis. The commission's decision was first leaked to Rossiyskaya Gazeta, the government-owned daily, which promptly labeled Novaya Gazeta's reporting as unsubstantiated. Soon, other Kremlin-linked outfits echoed this characterization, in what Western observers decried as a blatant attempt to discredit reporting seen as highly damaging to Putin and others in his oligarchic circles. Wait, just kidding. None of that happened. Or rather, a fact pattern nearly identical to the one above did take place. It's just that it transpired right here in the United States, in our Atlantic fortress of liberty, as Russian dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn called it, and not in a cold and distant land Americans associate with ruthless dictators and corrupt oligarchs and their well-connected children. Here's what actually took place. On Monday, the U.S. Federal Election Commission decreed that there was nothing untoward about Twitter's decision to censor a story in the New York Post in October detailing Hunter Biden's corrupt dealings, including his arranging a 2015 meeting between his father, then the second most powerful man in the world, and the Obama administration's point man on Ukraine, and Burisma, a shady Ukrainian energy firm that was paying the illustrious vice presidential son some $83 a month for his expertise in Eastern European energy affairs, no doubt. The FEC, it seems, has concluded that Twitter's decision was a purely commercial one, having to do with the tech giant's policy against publishing hacked materials, according to an outline of its ruling obtained by the New York Times, most likely thanks to a leak by a left-leaning member of the FEC staff. The decision and the Times report announcing it are a tangle of lies. No, the Hunter story wasn't based on hacked materials. The Post was clear all along how it obtained the laptop material, and it bears repeating for the 1,000th time. Neither Hunter nor his father has disputed the authenticity of the emails obtained by the Post. Hunter has even suggested the laptop could be his. The Post story is emphatically not substantiated. But this is America in 2021. We Americans live under a regime. In a technical sense, all peoples live under regimes. Every nation has an organized political order. But I use the term regime in the menacing sense usually applied by American liberals to places like, well, Putin's Russia. Only our regime is far more sophisticated than Putin's crude autocracy. It exerts its tyranny through private actors, Silicon Valley workers, Times reporters. The regime has acquitted itself. Angela Codevilla has an essay in American Greatness called Epitaph for the War on Terror. Avenging 9/11 and preventing its recurrence was justification for putting enormous effort and money into unrelated or even counterproductive activities the ruling class sold to us as anti-terrorism. Well, you can't have a policy. You can't have a viable policy anymore in the United States or in Canada, for that matter, that doesn't make the 1% richer. Come on, that's the game. I mean, is there anyone who doesn't understand it any longer? Key bono, Codevilla asks. Estimates of the war on terror's cost of money start at 8 to 10 trillion. To whom did that money go? Yes, millions, maybe even billions, went to rent the cooperation of Iraqis, Afghans, etc. But the trillions went chiefly to Americans, to the national security establishment, the armed forces and intelligence community for enhanced careers and operations, and to their contractors, plus to the horde of civilian specialists employed to improve health, education, welfare, and social practices in social lands, our transportation network, and all manner of manufacturing and servicing. The consultant class also took it to the bank and the people who run the conferences. Think of all the reputations, careers, retirements on the golf course, second homes, fancy cars, and vacations, all this made possible. Think also of how fast and how far the war on terror advanced the ruling class's perennial objective to limit the freedoms of Americans outside its orbit and perhaps shut down domestic opposition. When leftist Americans, alumni of Americans for a Democratic Society, a covert CIA subsidiary, hijacked airliners to Cuba, the ruling class would not hear of ending the problem by forcing Castro to give them up. Instead, they made it a crime for ordinary air travelers to defend themselves. After 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security set about establishing a new way of life in America based on badges and regulations about what clearance would be needed to go where. The ruling class cares nothing of their effect, or overwhelmingly the lack thereof, on terrorism, just as it does not care what effect its shifting, contradictory mandates concerning COVID have on public health. And it does not even try to explain how adding minuscule amounts of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere adversely affects the planet's climate. No, the ruling class takes any and all occasions to advance its overriding objective in its own domination. Terrorism, however, is especially useful. That is why the New York Times formulated the War on Terror's official epitaph, a war on terror accounting since 9/11. The fall of Kabul shouldn't obscure the successes over 20 years. Experts say it is a success of a multilateral effort that extends to as many as 85 countries. Codevilla concludes, who are you to disagree, white man? And finally, on this topic, this is from Catherine Hamilton at Breitbart. Senators Marco Rubio and Kevin Cramer sent a letter to U.S. Department of the Treasury on Wednesday expressing concern about banks discriminating against Americans based on political views and beliefs. The senators referenced an incident that occurred in August, in which J.P. Morgan Chase allegedly terminated Lori Flynn's credit cards due to the bank's concerns of reputational risk. Mrs. Flynn is the wife of Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, former National Security Advisor to President Trump, who received a pardon from him for allegations he lied to the FBI during the Russia collusion hoax. The bank has since claimed the termination was in error and reinstated her account, according to the Washington Examiner. We've contacted our customer to let her know that we made an error, a Chase spokesperson said, and we apologize for any inconvenience this caused. Well, we hear so much about these errors, those pesky algorithms out of control. But it's funny who are the people who get hurt by these so-called mistakes. People like Mrs. Flynn or Alex Berenson repeatedly with Amazon. Oh, we made a mistake. And this happens again and again, but the message is delivered. We can keep this up. We can keep making these mistakes. And you know, and we know how embarrassing it is when you buy something, you try to buy something at a store, and you're told by the sales clerk in front of a bunch of people that no, sorry, Mrs. Flynn, I'm afraid your card's been rejected. In fact, it's been revoked. Oh, golly, this woman and her husband must have terrible credit. People get the message, and I will mention, not for the first time, that J.P. Morgan Chase, given the tens of billions of dollars now it has been fined for its criminal activities by the United States government, is essentially a criminal organization. Let's go back to the chat. Okay. Poppers have been essentially banned in Canada since 2013. They're classified as a prescription drug, meaning they can't be sold without Health Canada approval, and no products have been approved. That's from Brandon Smith. My Trail of Disgrace says government-funded free poppers for all alphabet people, including dispensers, outside nightclubs, steam baths, etc. Anything less is pure homophobia. It's hard to imagine KMG picking out and buying a South Park tie. Must have been gifted, says Don Willis. It was. Indeed. I wrote an essay about South Park, I don't know, a year or so after it started. It was printed in textbooks. Seriously. It was printed in more than one textbook. And I suppose someone who saw that sent me this tie. David the Gnome says the regime can't really commit treason by ignoring an outsider thrust into their midst like Trump was. Chokokin 666 says military usurpation of the civilian chain of command is the very definition of a coup. No Sleep Till Breezewood PA says, imagine getting thrown under the bus by a combo of a pudgy impeachment witness and Bill Kristol's think tank. Chokokin 666 asks, who is Ludendorff here? Well, you know, when the military gets involved directly in politics in a coup-like manner like this, it often leads to civil war within the military, typically by younger, lower-ranking officers. Is that what America is being set up for? By Bidenistas? That America can become like a, I don't know, North African or Middle Eastern country or an African country where one group of army officers replaces another group of army officers, accusing the previous lot of being traitors. Enderman says, the General's Call could be something out of a Strangelove remake. Well, how do you think I feel, Z? Yes, President Mervyn Mufkey. Okay. Well, who else? Let's see. David Wright says, Kunstler is always right on his takes and wrong on his predictions of the repercussions of them. Well, you know, perhaps he's sticking with Antonio Gramsci's famous line, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Okay, let's scroll down and see what we got. The latest things. Something about Bickle. My Trail of Disgrace says, Conservative Party of Canada, their last few leadership elections, particularly federal and Ontario, have seemed sketchy. The worst possible choice seems to manage to just edge out better candidates. Well, it's sketchy because they only have one ballot. And it's a ranked choice. when Andrew Scheer was chosen over Bernier, there was just one ballot, and the media continues to this day to lie about it. They talk about 14 ballots. No, there was one ballot. Now, the result, they could have come up with the result, what, in 30 seconds or whatever? You know, first ballot, second ballot, third ballot. You know, they have computers now to do this, and computers are very, very fast. But they spun it out over hours to deceitfully give the impression that there were separate ballots, and there was only one. The advantage of a traditional leadership convention is that you get activists in one place, creating a feeling of solidarity. And you make them vote with people dropping off if they fall below a certain percentage of support, or if they're, the last man on the totem pole, such that the winner actually receives, 50 plus one at least of active votes, not, third choice, seventh choice, 13th choice. But the parties in their wisdom have decided to give up on tradition, which means that pretty much every choice is disputed now, which is not good for a party. Don Willis says, I miss the mean computer girl saying goodbye. David the Gnome says, I saw a video today of the terror of the service industry, aka a black group of patrons at a restaurant beating the tar out of a hostess who insisted they have all vax cards to dine indoors. Yes, that's gone viral, has it not? Kontiki Roulette says, my friend's son was told he needed to have the vaccine to get a haircut, 17 years old. It's spreading like cancer. Well, I see this ad for a device, sort of a superior Flowbee, and it's titanium coated. If you can comb it, you can shave it. I guess in the last couple of years, a lot more people have been cutting their own hair. I mean, I do it myself. I'm not all that good at it. But this device, it looks pretty, and you can adjust it to various lengths, right? Chogokin 666 says, Nabisco hired actual goons to fight striking Teamsters and tobacco confection workers. Okay. And Metatron, hello. The Met Gala was either meant to antagonize or simply a sign that they are drunk on power. I could believe either at this point. They're playing with fire. They're playing with fire. AOC shows up in that gown, tax the rich, and that hideous lesbian vampire, Cara Delevingne, Peg, the patriarchy, the furor that they are inciting in people. They don't care because as far as they're concerned, such people don't exist. If I were attempting to, play at being the Huey Long of this century, I would not wear such a gown. I would not go to the Met Gala. I would not be there with Edgar Bronfman. No, but these people, they don't care. They simply don't care. Hello to Lou. Hello to Ogan's Iron. John Willis references To Sir with Love, sung by Lulu. She covered 2 David Bowie songs in the 1970s and had a hit with one of them. Watch That Man and The Man Who Sold the World. They're pretty good, actually. And let's get back to it here. Oh, yes. Home invasion. I suppose some latrine Wallace in Canada are rather jealous of the autocracy that has descended on Australia. This is from Anthony Fury at the Toronto Sun. If you thought your home was one place where you could relax without worrying about getting fined over pandemic rules, think again. Durham Region's top doctor, or latrine Walla, has quietly passed new rules on what authority? Mandating that all residents must conduct contact tracing of anyone who comes to their house for a social gathering. This is regardless of how many people are in attendance, how well they know each other, and the purpose of the visit. If someone is found to be not complying, they can be hit with a $5,000 fine. Dr. Robert Kyle, Durham Region's chief latrinewala, issued this as a Section 22 class order under the Ontario Health and Protection and Promotion Act that came into effect September 10th. The new rule means that coffee dates with a best friend or a play date between toddlers must now be documented and handed over to the regional health department upon request. An official fact sheet clarifies the rules for residents of the Greater Toronto Area neighborhood. Maintain a list of full names and contact information, including phone numbers for all attendees of the social gathering, regardless of age, in a private dwelling and/or commercial premises, and upon request, shall provide Durham Region Health Department with this information within 24 hours of the request or other time specified. Maintain the list of names and contact information, including phone numbers for attendees at the social gathering for a period of at least 1 month. The fact sheet specifies that a social gathering is a gathering of 2 or more people who do not reside in the same household. This means that private residences in Durham now face similar rules as public-facing businesses. It means the government is now setting rules for private social interactions. Oh, but if it saves just one life. Goodbye Pfizer, hello Comirnaty, top COVID-19 vaccines given brand names in Canada. Health Canada has approved brand names for Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca vaccines and announced the change on social media today. So it says full approval by the vaccines. Well, we were told in the United States by the media, which lied to us again, big surprise there, that the American vaccines were given full and not just emergency approval by the FDA. This turned out to be an outright lie. What the FDA said that they'd given full approval to a future vaccine called Comirnaty, which will be introduced at some time in the future. And so the same old Pfizer vaccine is distributed now under emergency use authorization as it had been before. And this is significant because when the vaccines are no longer authorized under the EUA, then Pfizer will be subject to lawsuits when things go wrong. It's nice to know how the mighty government of the United States has been reduced to a water boy for big pharma. And in Saskatchewan, which allegedly has a so right-wing government, which has been barely touched by COVID-19, but its premier, Scott Moe, announced Thursday that the province will implement mandatory masking, a proof of vaccination policy, and a requirement for government employees to get vaccinated or receive negative tests. Yes. Yeah. These people who call themselves libertarians or used to be called libertarians, they're all the same chickens. From the LA Times, 1 in 3 COVID-19 patients suffer from long COVID. A CDC study of Long Beach residents find, more money for doctors, more money for big pharma. Long COVID is the new chronic fatigue syndrome. I feel really crummy, and there's no reason why I feel really crummy, so I must have a disease, which we're going to give a name. Chronic fatigue syndrome. I don't know. You're just depressed. That's what it is. But no, it has to be a disease because that sounds more respectable, and you can take drugs for it. And we know that drugs are wonderful and everyone should be taking drugs, many, many different kinds of drugs. Increasingly, the medical ads that I see on MeTV, my old man's TV station, are drugs to treat the symptoms you get from taking other drugs, particularly antidepressant and antipsychotic drugs. They cause tremors. That's one of the major side effects. Bad news for the Biden administration, but perhaps they're just going to steamroll over this. This is from the conservative Treehouse at Sundance. The FDA advisory group, which evaluates the efficacy and safety of vaccines, has rejected the request for Pfizer booster shots. However, the White House, desperately trying to push as many needle jabs as possible, was already on track to giving booster shots this month. The implication here is the White House was not following the recommendations of the FDA or the science. And we're going to see more and more of stories like the following from the New York Post, Jeremy Layton. Former Yankee Didi Gregorius is in the middle of the worst season of his career and chose a controversial reason on which to blame his struggles. Speaking to the Philadelphia Inquirer, Gregorius, now with the Phillies, said he developed an elbow condition after he was vaccinated for COVID-19 called pseudo-gout, a form of arthritis that causes painful swelling. The shortstop said the condition hurt his performance throughout the season. Gregorius said, "Some people say it's from the vaccine. I will say it's likely from that too. But when you say that, everyone looks at you like you're stupid because the vaccine is not supposed to be like that or give you that reaction." Experts are skeptical of his claims. However, experts, including the CDC, are not skeptical of the whopper called long COVID. You know, people used to get a disease called the flu, and sometimes influenza was pretty serious. It would knock you out for a week, 10 days. And then people would say that they felt that they hadn't really got back to speed after this recent bad bout of influenza. And that's exactly what long COVID is. Again, from the New York Post, this time from Hannah Sparks. Unvaccinated people are declaring themselves purebloods, and you know where this is going, don't you? From now on, I refuse to be referred to as unvaccinated, said conservative influencer Lindsay Marie in a post last week. I want everyone to now call me pureblood. Her hashtags included Harry Potter, pureblood, and unvaccinated. Marie is most likely referring to a term more recently popularized by the Harry Potter series, which saw wizards and warlocks with the most magical progeny assigned as purebloods or half-bloods, as opposed to muggles, mere humans, who practice magic. So, where are we going here? From Doc on Twitter, if you're going to call yourself pureblood, don't be shocked when we call you a Nazi. Of course, of course, of course. The tweet included a screenshot describing the blood purity dogma of Nazi Germany. When did Hitler die? It was just a couple of years ago, wasn't it? 1945? Let me do some math here. That's 55 plus 21. That was 76 years ago, almost 4 generations ago. You wouldn't know it, though, would you? Because he's always lurking on the horizon. He's going to get back in power somehow. God knows how. This is from Carl Hennigan and Martin Koldorf, who are actually scientists. Hennigan is a professor of evidence-based medicine at the University of Oxford, and Koldorf is a professor of medicine at Harvard. This is from The Federalist. Stanford faculty smear professor who accurately summarized data on masks. Last week, anonymous posters with the portrait of Stanford University professor of medicine Dr. Jay Bhattacharya were plastered on kiosks around the Stanford campus, linking him to COVID deaths in Florida, even though cumulative age-adjusted COVID mortality is lower in Florida than in most large states. These smears appeared. Taking it one step further, the chair of Stanford's epidemiology department, Professor Melissa Bondi, circulated a petition among faculty members demanding that the university president exercise his obligation, quote, to clarify for the faculty the limits of public pronouncements when proclaiming on public health policy. Melissa Bondi, just let me do a quick image search of this woman and see what we get. Bing, 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 bing. Physiognomy is real. Proved once again. Truth. What is truth? Asked Pontius Pilate. And the answer from our elite is whatever the experts say. But there are experts with different opinions. Our experts. Truth is whatever our experts say. Oh, and also USA Today and Reuters and PolitiFact. Yes, they are the truth. And from Germany, this is from Deutsche Welle. Facebook deletes accounts of German anti-lockdown group. The tech giant says the Querdenken lateral thinking movement was causing social harm by promoting conspiracy theories against coronavirus restrictions. Social media giant Facebook deleted nearly 150 accounts, pages, and groups linked with Germany's Querdenken movement, the platform's representatives said Thursday. The people behind this activity used authentic and duplicate accounts to post and amplify violating content, primarily focused on promoting the conspiracy that the German government's COVID-19 restrictions are part of a larger plan to strip citizens of their freedoms and basic rights. Facebook head of security policy, Nathaniel Gleicher, told reporters. Well, can anyone say that they're surprised? According to Gleicher, such campaigns typically involve networks of primarily authentic users who organize to systematically violate our policies to cause harm on or off our platform. Again, hardly a surprise. And this from America, at the dailysignal.com. Amazon this week blocked an advertisement for a new book on Black Lives Matter's leaders, claiming content that revolves around controversial or highly debated social topics is not permitted. By the way, that's a direct quotation. Revolves around controversial or highly debated social topics is not permitted. BLM, The Making of a New Marxist Revolution, is the latest book by Mike Gonzalez, a former journalist who was a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation, parent organization of the Daily Signal. Update. Amazon notified the Heritage Foundation Thursday morning that it had reversed its action, saying, quote, "Our policies were inaccurately enforced, and the book is now being advertised. We are providing training to ensure our teams are clear on our policies," unquote. It's funny how this only happens in one direction. All these errors. And let's go to Alex Berenson and his Substack, Unreported Truths. There's a lot of free content. Most of the content on his Substack is free, but there are certain essays, including a preview of his upcoming book, Pandemia, which are for paying subscribers only. Boom goes the dynamite. The FDA advisory panel rejects COVID boosters for the general population. Scientists finally say enough is enough. Can't see how the FDA can say yes after this, although technically it can. Make no mistake, whatever happens next, this is a massive, massive hit for Uncle Joe and two-time Heisman winner, Dr. Anthony F. Fauci. And with no boosters, the vaccine failure will become more and more obvious in a matter of weeks. Solomon's choice. The scientists followed the science, but only so far. The FDA's 18-person advisory panel emphatically, 16-2, rejected a Pfizer COVID booster shot for the general population on the basis that they didn't have data to support it. Then they okayed the booster for the elderly and younger people at high risk, though they didn't explicitly define who those people might be. To be clear, even less data supports the use of a booster in the elderly than in younger people. In the data Pfizer has presented so far, over 95% of the people who receive the booster are under 55. That said, people over 65 and certainly 75 are at much, much higher risk of death from COVID than younger people, and they tend to have a less effective response to the vaccine. So splitting the baby this way certainly makes more sense than following the Biden administration's effort to jam a booster into everyone's arm. Fauci is correct that the original two-dose regimen is now failing to prevent symptomatic disease. And the FDA panel is correct that the data currently does not support the use of boosters in people over 65. Which raises the question, if you are under 65, not at high risk for severe COVID and have not yet been vaccinated, why on earth would you be? Putting side effects and long-term risks aside, you now know that vaccines are likely to do little more than to delay your risk of infection for a few months. What's the point? Mandates for the working age population make more sense than ever. And But then a less hopeful view. This is a new Substack feature that competes with Twitter from a reader. As you know, there is zero data supporting boosters in those over 65. Besides this, boiling the frog works this way. This was not a loss for Biden, but rather a planned phase-in. Gives the impression that the FBA has been thoughtful. I guarantee that boosters will be here for everyone within 2 months maximum. If it happens in 2 weeks, I won't be surprised. And let's take a look at Lockdown Skeptics, or dailyskeptic.org, as it is known. Every prosecution under emergency COVID powers was wrong, review finds. Crown Prosecution Service, that's of England, data shows that hundreds of innocent people were wrongfully charged with many cases deemed unlawful, reports The Telegraph. Why didn't doctors listen to women about the link between COVID vaccines and periods? A new study reveals that thousands of women experienced irregularities after their jab, yet the medical establishment seems disinterested. No, the word is uninterested, actually, reports The Telegraph. I will not obey any more lockdowns. If Boris Johnson attempts to lock down Britain again, there will be mass disobedience, Nigel Farage tells Stephen Edgington in an interview for The Telegraph. This bullying around the vaccine only adds to vaccine hesitancy and fuels the fire of the conspiracy theorists, says Mark Dolan. The government's latest scary modeling is already wrong. Wales to introduce vaccine passport checks at nightclubs and large events next month. Almost a quarter of COVID inpatients in England are primarily being treated for something else. Well, apparently, figure in the United States, or the admitted figure, is somewhere like 40 to 50%. Which rather, look what happened last year. For months and months and months and months, if your medical problem isn't COVID, stay out of the hospital. We won't let you in. So, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This was all put off. And so when non-COVID people, those commoners were allowed back in hospital, you had delayed medical care for many, 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 many months. So you're going to see much more reported incidents of this disease and hospital visits. That would seem to be the obvious explanation. Italy makes COVID Green Pass mandatory for all workers. Great Barrington author gets mobbed by his Stanford colleagues. This is a reference to Jay Bhattacharya, which I spoke of earlier. And that's it for that topic. Let's talk about hair. Let's talk about women's hair. Let's talk about Black women's hair, which is the best hair of all. This is from the Associated Press. And we're going to get more and more and more of these stories, and they're going to get funnier and funnier and funnier. The father of a 7-year-old Michigan girl whose hair was cut by a teacher without her parents' permission has filed a $1 million lawsuit against the school district, a librarian, and a teacher's assistant. The lawsuit was filed Tuesday in federal court in Grand Rapids against Mount Pleasant Public Schools. The suit alleges that the biracial girl's constitutional rights were violated, racial discrimination, ethnic intimidation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and assault and battery. Jimmy Hoffmeyer, the girl's father, is Black and white. Her mother is white. Hoffmeyer said that in March, his daughter, Journey, and just like, what was his name? Juicy Smollett? Something Smollett? He has a sister called Journey, and it's spelled exactly the same way, J-U-R-N-E-E, because of course you would want to spell your child's name this way. I'm reminded of a line in a Kingsley Amis novel about a woman with an exotic name, and the character is thinking, were her parents artistic or simply couldn't spell? When you give your child the name Journey, spelled J-U-R-N-E-E, a lot of people are going to think less of you because they're going to come to the conclusion that your parents were dimwits who couldn't spell. Anyway, Journey arrived home from Ganyard Elementary with much of the hair on one side of her head cut. She said a classmate had used scissors to cut her hair on a school bus, Hoffmeyer told the AP in April. Well, really? A classmate? Was this classmate named? Do the authorities know who the school know who this classmate was? Does the classmate, did she admit to doing this? Or did Journey cut her hair herself, which is something that many young girls do, usually to the absolute horror and often fury of their parents. 2 days after the bus incident, and after Hoffmeyer complained to the principal and had his daughter's hair styled at a salon with an asymmetrical cut to make the differing lengths less obvious, Journey arrived home with the hair on the other side cut. I asked what happened and said, "I thought I told you no child should ever cut your hair," Hoffmeyer said at the time. She said, "But Dad, it was the teacher. The teacher cut her hair to even it out." Hoffmeyer said the girl who cuts Journey's hair and the teacher who cut it are white. It's entirely possible, it seems to me, that maybe children were laughing at her hair, and she asked the teacher's aide or whatever it was to even out her hair. Seems entirely possible to me, but no, this is, what does this Steve Saylor call this? World War hair. But we have even more hair news. This is a story. This is a hate hoax. This was the biggest story in Canada for the week, and then it all fell apart, and everyone pretended that it never happened. And let's talk about Islamophobia. This is a story in the Toronto Star by Fatima Saeed and Jenna Moon. Attack on a girl wearing a hijab didn't happen, police say. Okay. But why did the Toronto District School Board let the tearful 11-year-old face the cameras? Days after an 11-year-old girl alleged that a man cut her hijab twice, Toronto police have concluded the events did not happen. In a statement released Monday, the police, who had been investigating the alleged incident involving the grade 6 student at Pauline Johnson Jr. Public School as a hate crime, said the investigation is now concluded. But the real, Shri Paradkar has a similar story. A girl's hijab story isn't true, but we'd be fools to believe anti-Muslim hatred doesn't exist in Canada. And there's even more anti-Muslim hatreds when Muslims frequently make up stories about things that never happened. Here's another story from the CBC. This is it's become a major issue in Canada. This is from Leslie Amundsen. And it's from earlier this year. Coming home, the fight for black hair care in Nova Scotia. How changes in beauty education could mean a more inclusive industry. Well, Nova Scotia was the main region where those black people came to Canada via the Underground Railroad. So of the 34,400 blacks who lived in Canada in 1971, most of them were in Nova Scotia. I find it difficult to believe that where there is a concentration of black people at any place, there are not people there to deal with their special hair needs. But this is what we're being told. Black beauty services have not always been easy to access in Nova Scotia, and that has one woman pushing for change to make the beauty industry more inclusive. Well, open up a shop then. You know, if there's a demand that's not being met, is that really hard to figure out? Samantha Dixon Slaughter owns Styles by SD, a hair salon in Dartmouth. On top of being a hairdresser and business owner, she describes herself as a black beauty advocate. Quote, I think that black beauty has not been given the ears or the eyes of people in government or in organizations who should be looking at the black consumer and have not been paying any attention. So for me, it's important, unquote. Again, if there's a demand that's not being met, isn't this capitalism 101? But there's more to it than that. Dixon Slaughter is calling on the Cosmopolitan Association of Nova Scotia to allow hairdressing students to get their licenses through in-salon training. Before hairdressing was recognized as a trade in the province in 1995, stylists could get their license by studying 1,200 hours in a salon. See, in this attempt to evade a government regulation. There have always been barriers to black hair care in the province, but there have also been pioneers who found ways to offer those services when no one else was doing it. Viola Desmond was one of Nova Scotia's first black hairstylists to offer professional services. She also owned and operated a school, Viola Desmond School of Beauty Culture, where she trained other women in black hair care. It makes you feel small, said Dixon Slaughter. I mean, it really makes you feel small because she did it back then when there was so much else she had to deal with. I mean, we deal with some of that stuff now subtly. So in a way, I also feel accomplished. And Viola Desmond, she's a Canadian hero, even though she left Canada and moved to the United States, where she died. Let's see. Here's how she is one of Canada's greatest heroes. In 1946, she challenged racial segregation at a cinema in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, by refusing to leave a whites-only area of the Roseland Theatre. For this, she was convicted of a minor tax violation for the 1-cent tax difference between the seat that she had paid for and the seat that she had used, which was more expensive. 2010, she was granted a posthumous pardon. Minor tax violation. What did she have to pay, 50 cents or a buck or something? But let me tell you how Canada works now. 2018, Desmond became the first Canadian woman to appear alone in a Canadian banknote, a $10 bill, which was unveiled by Finance Minister Bill Morneau and Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Paulos during a ceremony at the Halifax Central Library on March 18, 2018. Yeah. Guess who Viola Desmond replaced on the $10 bill? John A. Macdonald. Yes, the first Prime Minister of Canada, who was Prime Minister for 6, then 13 years, for 19 years, the godfather of the Canadian Pacific Railroad, etc., etc., but nowhere near as important as a hairdresser from Nova Scotia who once was forced to pay a small fine. One laughs lest one weeps. And there's a story from Martha Nduwayo for CBC First Person, how we're helping low-income Black Montrealers get the mental health support they need to flourish. I don't understand. How about low-income white Montrealers? Do they get the mental health support they need to flourish? She begins, I've always loved helping others work through their problems. For years, I wanted to be a therapist or a psychologist. And she goes on to claim that she couldn't do this because a great deal of volunteer work is needed on studies, and she couldn't do it. Ironically, I felt myself depressed and anxious all while studying depression and anxiety. Yes, it's funny how that works. The passive anti-Black comments made by students and teachers, as opposed to active, passive. So people looked at her the wrong way, or she thinks that people looked at her the wrong way, made by students and teachers, and lack of representation within the learning material. The studies and the professors at times left me feeling alienated and unmotivated. And so how do you think that where do you think that this woman works now? When the pandemic arrived in March 2020, I'd been working a full-time job at the federal government for about a year. Oh, that's good, right? Because federal government jobs are like forever. And you don't have to worry about, missing a paycheck. And there's a really excellent pension scheme. And salaries are high. But no, wait. I was suddenly working from home in a crowded house and never had a moment to myself. I realized that so many of us were struggling, even those people that didn't have high-paying government jobs. By June, my mental health had never been so low. I was suffocating in my house. There were never enough walks to calm me down. I was constantly grieving, and Black trauma was constantly being shared and reshared online. Okay. It's just never good enough. Never good enough. A strange story from the Daily Mail about chess, about a female chess player, quite an accomplished one. A Soviet chess legend filed a $5 million defamation lawsuit against Netflix for an episode of The Queen's Gambit that inaccurately states she never competed with men. 80-year-old Nona Gaprindashvili from Georgia is a pioneer of women's chess and the first woman to be awarded the Grand Master title. She said the way she was portrayed in a Netflix episode was sexist and diminishing. The Queen's Gambit follows the life of Beth Harmon, a gifted girl from the 1950s who grows up in a Kentucky orphanage and goes on to become a chess legend. The character, based on that 1983 novel, you could have mentioned the author, and portrayed by renowned actress Anya Taylor-Joy, beats even the most impressive Russian players of the time. And in a scene, the announcer says the only unusual thing about her really is her sex, and even that's not unique in Russia. There's Nona Gaprindashvili, but she's the female world champion, has never faced men. It turns out that is a whopper, an absolute whopper. She has competed against at least 59 male chess players, 28 of them simultaneously in one game. That didn't really count, including at least 10 grandmasters at the time, including Dragolyub Velimirovich, Svetoslav Gligorich, Paul Keres, Boyan Karadzhika, Boris Spassky, Viswanathan Anand, and Mikhail Tal. The last three were also world champions during his career. And if you go to Wikipedia, you find out that this woman, very accomplished indeed. We'll leave aside her victory amongst women. She co-won the Hastings tournament in 1963, which is, at the Challengers tournament. She tied for a second place at male tournament in 1976, tied for first place at Lone Pine in 1977, and Lone Pine was one of the premier chess tournaments in the United States at that time, and tied for a second at Dortmund in 1978. So no, she was the real thing, and it's very sad that whoever responsible for this Netflix documentary, couldn't have gone on Wikipedia to look this woman up, or they just decided to make a point, that women were so terribly discriminated against, even at a time when they weren't. And I'm going to talk about emojis here briefly before I move on to the book club. And of course, the show started late today. Sorry for that once again. This is by Kate Dunlap at the excellent site conservativewoman.co.uk. The Pregnant Man Emoji, more woke poison for young minds. The latest release. I can see your eyebrows lifting. Emoji, who cares? Perhaps you should, because the new range includes a pregnant man. Emoji were created in 1999 by the Japanese artist Shigetaka Kurita for Japan's smartphone market and spread to the entire world. Many Japanese cell phone makers let their users send emojis years before Apple and Google adopted them. They are now universal. Emoji play a big part in youth culture, although appeal does tend to bypass the majority of adults. In 2015, Oxford Dictionaries named the face with tears of joy emoji below the word of the year. Oh, okay. I'm looking at a big version of this emoji, and I wouldn't have guessed that it's tears of joy. It looks like tears of grief, tears of rage, tears of panic. The pregnant man will join recent innovations, including the man in a wedding veil, same-sex couple, the alphabet people and transgender flags, the bearded woman, and the neutral Father Christmas. It is intended to support any transgender man who identifies as a seahorse daddy. The move is part of the consortium's express objective to make text more inclusive and gender neutral, i.e. fluid, asexual, and non-binary. Some people find the notion of a pregnant man offensive and a slight to accepted mores of sex and sexuality. Others consider the promotion of such representations to be a corruption of reality and another attempt to undermine women's biological role in conception, pregnancy, and childbirth, a deliberate effort to deny what it means to be a woman and a mother, an attempt to shift children's perception in the process. Most men find childbirth to be rather horrifying, but it's a woman thing, because only women, can conceive, can be pregnant, can give birth. And we're also feminists now that we decided to let men horn in on this. There's one thing that was unmistakably, uniquely female, and somehow that's offensive or fascist, as a scholar, Judith Butler, would say. Before I move on to the book club, let's take a look at the chat. Don Willis said, had a friend at City. He belonged to the New York Chess Club, member for 8 years, never won a game against a GM. True story, bro. I used to be a tournament player. I was a tournament player for 3 years. I retired, as it were, in 1972 after my best result at the BC Open in 1972. I scored 3.5, 3.5. And after spending about a year studying chess theory, devoting pretty much the entirety of my life to it, I just decided I was never going to be that good at it. And since chess basically sucks the life, it sucks the air out of your life, just, there's a vacuum created, which is filled by chess exclusively. I just decided this was not an optimal use of my time. Different than Gnome says, I'm okay at chess, but I cannot imagine how good the really good players are. True Greenbeer says, I'm over 1,800 on Lee Chess, but I think their rating system is inflated. I really should study up and break 2,000. I'm such a lazy bastard. Anwar says, do they now? Most men seem to be in the delivery rooms these days. Yes, and there have been studies done of this, of the sexual life of these couples after the man has seen what happens during childbirth. Suddenly, to a lot of them, it becomes horrible that they just have to, just think about something else. Let's not think about the mechanics of this. No, it's unnatural. Women are meant to give birth, to be assisted by other women. That's what's natural. Norman Podhoritz's wife, Mitch Decter, wrote a very good essay some decades ago in which she stated, a woman herself, that men being present at childbirth becoming de rigueur, she could only regard this as a form of revenge practiced by women against men. I've suffered, now it's your turn. You did this to me. Let's see. Ogan's Iron said KMG received a small magazine with essays from various frog Twitter guys, Bap and Conrad Black. David the Gnome says, yay, KMG, a chess master, who knew? I could have, if I kept it up, I could have been rated over 2,000. I'm pretty sure of that. But again, it is just such a time sink. Also, you need the killer instinct. I knew the Canadian champion. I knew the BC champion. Well, I knew 2 Canadian champions. I knew the BC champion. And they typically, the BC champion at the time, or later, a year or 2 after I stopped playing BC champion, he once referred to Lubomir Kavalek, who was one of the top players in the world at one time, top 10 rated, ELO rated, as a potser, because this is the attitude that they all have. You're all idiots. You are worthless. I will destroy you. I have only contempt for your inferiority. Gligoric, the Serb, was not like this, but it is very difficult to go anywhere in the chess world without becoming a megalomaniac. And I did not like that idea. Enron says, I agree. The idea of being in the delivery room repulses me. When was the system of watching implemented? I would say in the 1970s is that men started to be bullied. I once, Ken White was the first editor of the National Post and later editor and publisher of Maclean's. I knew him. He had worked at, he'd left Alberta Report shortly before I started, but I met him at Lauren Gunter's house many times and at other places. And I remember at one of Ted Byfield's famous Boxing Day parties that he was having an animated conversation with Link Byfield's wife. And it was all about, the joys of childbirth and becoming a father and how it transformed his life and, how he'd been in the delivery room. Yeah, you're trying to suck up to a woman by talking about this. Just contemptible. So, I don't know, I waded up to them and I said something like, I'm told that when I was born, that was my father's first child, he spent the day in a bar. Quite the best way, I said. And I noticed the horrified look on Ken White's face and the angry look on Link Byfield's wife's face. And I thought, my work here is done. So let's go to the book club. And our book today is by a UCLA professor called Robert Edgerton, and it is called Six Societies, Challenging the Myth of Primitive Harmony. And it was published by the Free Press in 1992. Edgerton is an anthropologist, and if nothing else, this book, if you read this book, you will get a potted history of anthropology and of prevailing attitudes of thought in it from the beginning of anthropology to the present day, well, at least 1992. He begins, all societies are sick, but some are sicker than others. This paraphrase of Orwell's famous quip about the equality of animals calls attention to the existence of traditional beliefs and practices that threaten human health and happiness more in some societies than in others. But it also indicates that there are some customs and social institutions in all societies that compromise human well-being. Even populations that appear to be well adapted to their environments maintain some beliefs or practices that unnecessarily imperil their well-being or, in some instances, their survival. Populations the world over have not been well served by some of their beliefs, such as, for example, those concerning witchcraft, the need for revenge or male supremacy, and many of their traditional practices involving nutrition, healthcare, and the treatment of children have been harmful as well. Slavery, infanticide, human sacrifice, torture, female genital mutilation, rape, homicide, feuding, suicide, and environmental pollution have sometimes been needlessly harmful to some or all members of a society, and under some circumstances, they can threaten social survival. To Americans besieged by headlines and television reports concerning our endangered environment, homelessness, child abuse, the threat of drugs, AIDS, or gang violence, the idea that some things people do may be harmful to themselves and others will hardly seem controversial. Beliefs that lead to anorexia nervosa or wife beating are likely to be seen as harmful, and beliefs favoring anti-Semitism or male supremacy are also likely to be seen as dangerous. Americans may also believe that if surveys can rate various cities in the United States in terms of their relative quality of life, the same could be done for foreign cities and, for that matter, foreign countries. Many would surely be troubled by the idea that the political systems of Iraq, Hitler's Germany, or the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia were or are as good as though in, say, Norway, Japan, or Switzerland. And they would probably react with disbelief to the assertion that there is no scientific basis for evaluating other societies' practice of genocide, judicial torture, or human sacrifice, for example, except as the people in that society themselves evaluate these practices. Yet that is exactly what the principle of cultural relativism asserts, and this principle continues to be widely and strongly held. So too is the belief that primitive societies were far more harmonious than societies caught up in the modern world. We know that human misery, fear, loneliness, pain, sickness, and premature death are typical of America's urban ghettos and its homeless people, South Africa's black townships, the starving villages of the Sudan, the slums of Brazil, and the war-ravaged lands of Central America or the Middle East. We also know that people in places such as these are the hapless victims of such forces as governmental neglect, racism, corruption, ethnic, religious, and political strife, and economic exploitation, among other kinds of social, cultural, and economic pressures. However, many prominent scholars believe that this sort of misery is not natural to the human condition, that people in smaller, more homogeneous folk communities have historically lived in greater harmony and happiness, and that many small populations continue to do so today. The belief that primitive societies are more harmonious than modern ones, that savages are noble, and that life in the past was more idyllic than life today is not only reflected in the motion pictures and novels of our popular culture. The recently acclaimed film Dances with Wolves comes immediately to mind. It is deeply ingrained in scholarly discourse as well. This community-lost way of reconstructing history is founded in the romantic belief that the malaise and mayhem of the modern world is not the natural human condition. Instead, human misery is thought to be the product of pervasive social disorganization, divisive ethnic or religious diversity, class conflict, or competing interests that plague large societies, particularly nation states. Because smaller and simpler societies, on the other hand, develop their cultures in response to the demands of their immediate and stable environments, their ways of life must have produced far greater harmony and happiness for their populations. Robin Fox, for example, vividly described the Upper Paleolithic environment of big game hunters as one in which, quote, there was a harmony of our evolved attributes as a species, including our intelligence, our imagination, our violence, and hence our violent imagination, our reason, and our passions, a harmony that has been lost, unquote. If a small society is found that lacks harmony, many social scientists conclude that this condition must be the result of the disorganizing effects of culture contact, particularly urbanization. This idea, like cultural relativism, has been deeply embedded in Western thought for centuries, and it persists in scholarly thinking today. This is to say that this book by Robert Edgerton, Six Societies, was extraordinarily controversial when it was issued in 1992, and I suspect that is still extraordinarily controversial now. Who are we to judge other societies? That's strange. You know, it's very strange because we do a lot of judging. For instance, that people who disagree with elite politics are Hitler, for example, or that people who voted for Donald Trump are all knuckle-dragging troglodytes, say, or that certain parts of the country, say the Southlands of the United States, are horrible, horrible places because they keep electing Republicans. So no, we are constantly judging, but we are judging ourselves, and we typically judge ourselves as being inferior, you know, to these primitive folk societies, which were just so very homogeneous. Well, you might remember that in our discussion of Joseph Tainter's The Collapse of Complex Society, he mentioned the Ich People of Uganda. And the Ich people come up in this book as well, because it is difficult to think of a society, you know, in modern times, more crushed, more lacking of anything decent than the Ich, where families barely exist. And as for, you know, communitarianism, no, zero, absolute nothing. He refers to, let's see, an even more popular book, probably the most widely read ethnography ever written, is The Forest People, an account of the Mbuti Pygmies of Zaire's Ituri Forest, written by Colin M. Turnbull in 1961. Rich in detail and personal observation, Turnbull's gracefully written book describes a people who lived in what he portrays as an almost perfect harmony with the forest that provided for all their needs. According to Turnbull, the Mbuti had no homicide, no suicide or rape, no painful initiations or mutilations, and no warfare. Turnbull admitted that the Mbuti were quarrelsome and sometimes fought, that they lied, stole, and sometimes refused to share, and he neglected to mention that men who owned hunting nets exploited men who did not, but no matter. For Turnbull, the Mbuti were loving, happy people whose culture made them one with their forest world. As seen through Turnbull's eyes, the Mbuti were the very prototype of a folk society. Few of Turnbull's anthropological colleagues challenged the accuracy of his account. Turnbull was unabashedly enamored of the loving, harmonious way of life that he believed the Mbuti embodied, so much so, in fact, that a decade later, when he studied another small society, he was openly appalled by their loveless existence. As he described them in another very popular book, The Mountain People, the Ich, a starving population of some 2,000 people in northern Uganda, had become so horrifically dehumanized, so ruthless about their individual survival, that Turnbull actually proposed to an official of the Ugandan government that they be forcibly rounded up and dispersed throughout the country, not, as one might have thought, to save them from starvation, but to assure that their asocial, loveless culture would die with them, never to corrupt other people. The anthropological reaction was harsh. Turnbull was severely criticized for painting too dismal a picture of Ich culture, as well as for unethical conduct. Well, you see, and Edgerton highlights this frequently in the book, that even these relativist anthropologists, or those that believe in adaptive behavior, there's a limit. There comes a limit with them. That this goes too far. Now, let's talk about adaptation. The so-called, adaptive anthropologists believe that all behavior demonstrated by people can be seen as a rational response to certain environments, conditions, stimuli, whatever, and that they serve a positive purpose. Well, this is a tautology. It is obviously a tautology. How do you know that these behaviors are adapted? Because these are the behaviors that certain peoples adopted. Now, a society which died out completely, like the Tasmanian Aborigines, well, I suppose you could say, well, their behavior wasn't adaptive. But is that how we're going to set the bar that low? And the adaptive anthropologists do. I mean, gross societies are frequently excused or even, celebrated. Many anthropologists believe that the cruel, harmful, or ineffective practices they see in a folk society are the result of social disorganization brought about by colonialism, something that in fact has often taken place. And certain practices, as all anthropologists know, are sometimes not reported because doing so would offend the people being described or discredit them in the eyes of others. For these reasons, along with other forms of personal bias, some anthropological monographs, or as they are called, ethnographies, are idealized, even romanticized portraits. For example, Jane Bellow wrote this about the Balinese. The babies do not cry, the small boys do not fight, the young girls bear themselves with decorum. Everyone carries out his appointed task with respect for his equals and superiors and gentleness and consideration for his dependents. The people adhere, apparently with ease, to the laws governing their actions, big and small, of their lives, unquote. Unfortunately for the authenticity of this idyllic vision, Bellow went on, unwittingly it would seem, to document instances in which men beat their wives, wives ran away from home, children defied their parents, and people rebelled against their customs and laws. He discusses the question of female genital mutilation, and it is difficult to read this, I don't know, without becoming ill, without becoming physically ill. I should mention before I get into that. Yeah, well, no, we'll just get into this directly. He writes, similarly, the practice of pharaonic circumcision or female genital infibulation, common in parts of Muslim Northeast Africa, involves slashing away a girl's clitoris and both sets of vaginal labia. The wound is sutured together, leaving an opening the size of a matchstick for the passage of urine and menstrual blood. When young women are married, this small opening must be surgically enlarged to permit sexual intercourse. In addition to inflicting great pain, these procedures carry a considerable risk for infection, infertility, and even death. Nevertheless, anthropologists have commonly chosen to interpret infibulation as an adaptive practice because the people who practice it zealously defend it, and because it can readily be seen how it reinforces values of female purity and family honor. That most societies in the world, including most Islamic societies, have managed to cherish female purity and family honor without practicing infibulation is rarely acknowledged. The cumulative impact of relativistic and adaptivist assumptions has led generations of ethnographers to believe that there simply must be a good social or cultural reason why a long-established belief or practice exists. If it has endured for any length of time, it must be adaptive, or so it has been assumed either implicitly or explicitly by most of the people who have written what we know about the lives in small traditional societies. But let's move on to Tasmania, which of course is an island south of the main continent of Australia. People have been known to live on Tasmania, an island about the size of Ireland, for over 20,000 years. And for the last 10 to 12,000 years, because of their cultural existence, these people were totally isolated from all other human populations. When Europeans first made contact with them in the 19th century, the approximately 4,000 Tasmanians then living had the simplest technology ever reported for any human society. Men relied on one-piece wooden spears and wooden clubs that they threw along with stones, usually with great accuracy. Women used simple wooden digging sticks to prise up roots, wooden chisels to prise shellfish off rocks, short grass ropes to climb trees, and woven grass bags to carry the fruits of their efforts. In addition to two types of temporary huts or windbreaks, the Tasmanians made pouches of animal skin and kelp, used abalone shells as drinking vessels, wore kangaroo skins slung over their shoulders for warmth, and fashioned a few ornaments. In all, the entire Tasmanian inventory of manufactured goods came to no more than 24 items. This Paleolithic technology had been replaced on the Australian mainland, where the Tasmanians had once lived, by a substantially more complex array of tools, weapons, and other artifacts long before European contact. In short, these Tasmanians put the lie to the myth of Homo faber. Now, consider this. The Australian Aborigines of mainland Australia are considered to be, well, the most primitive people in the world. Or if they're not the most primitive or lowest IQ, certainly close to it. And it turns out that they were as a wonder compared to the Tasmanians. The Tasmanians just seem to have been, well, I don't know, lazy, incurious. The Tasmanians lived in bands of 40 to 50 people led by an accomplished warrior. Each band claimed exclusive hunting and foraging rights over a territory of some 200 to 300 square miles stretching inland from a coastal strip to the wooded and mountainous interior. They subsisted on shellfish, seals, marsupials, and birds and their eggs, as well as various vegetables. In all, they ate 60 species of animals and 70 species of vegetables, moving continually in search of food. Each of the Tasmanian bands apparently had an adequate diet for much of the year, but during the frigid winter months, food shortages could become so extreme that they were reduced to eating kangaroo skins. What is known about the Tasmanians is based on observations not only by sundry explorers, missionaries, and settlers, but also by Francois Perron, the first person ever officially called an anthropologist, who visited Tasmania in 1802. The resulting ethnographic record, while spotty, is sufficient to suggest that all of the sources of maladaptation listed at the beginning of this chapter played a part in Tasmanian life. First, some of their basic economic practices appear to have been inefficient. For example, men clearly dominated women and benefited disproportionately from their labor and risk. Yet with the possible exception of spearing kangaroos and wallabies, a task at which men arguably would be more efficient than women, either sex could, in principle, have carried out any of the necessary subsistence activities. In reality, however, almost all of these activities, including the potentially most dangerous ones, fell exclusively or primarily to women. While men often remained in camp resting or talking, early European observers called them indolent, women fetched water and firewood and gathered vegetable products. They alone collected shellfish, the dietary staple, by diving deep into coastal waters where sharp rocks, unpredictable currents, and stingrays were dangerous hazards. More remarkable still, the job of climbing eucalyptus trees to a height as much of 90 feet to club possums to death also fell to women, and it was women who swam and crept up on sleeping seals to club them to death. Now, despite the fact that there were clearly marked out boundaries between these bands. There was constant warfare among them, and no reason for there to be warfare. And as Edgerton described, the Tasmanians lived frequently or continuously in a state of fear or even terror. There are other aspects of Tasmanian culture that appear to have been frankly maladaptive. As Rhys Jones has trenchantly pointed out, the Tasmanians either lost or abandoned some seemingly useful forms of the technology they originally brought to the island. They once had bone tools, wooden boomerangs, barbed spears, hafted stone tools, and edge-ground axes, but all these were gone long before the Europeans arrived. Most Tasmanian groups also lost the ability to make rafts or catamarans, even though these watercraft would have been useful in reaching nearby islands with rich food resources. And inexplicably, the Tasmanians also gave up fishing. Yes, it seems from a population that spent most of its time seeking food, ate virtually every other food source on the island, and were desperately hungry during winter months, to reject fish as a source of food borders on the bizarre. Indeed. Now, let's see. Oh, I wanted to mention Darwin in this book. And Darwin as applied to science. And Darwin as a guide to human evolution and human choices. Edgerton doesn't seem to take a strong stand one way or the other in this regard. The Darwinian view being that behaviors adopted by people, were to advance themselves. Now, this just runs into a brick wall, as far as I'm concerned, with rape. What are the possible evolutionary advantages of rape? I'm sorry, I'm not finding any. I'm sure some evolutionists could posit some, but any that they have just seem absolutely ridiculous to me. Edgerton deals at great length with the wickedness of witchcraft. I mean, wickedness not in a moral sense, perhaps, but how it is maladaptive, how it leads to people living lives of fear and terror. He also describes many strange anomalies. For instance, Eskimos deciding they had fished. They had taken a great deal of fish to supplement their meager diet from a lake. And then one day they decided the lake was haunted. So it was not possible to take fish, even though later they saw other people, not Eskimos, taking fish from this lake and eating it with no ill effects. They still persisted in the belief that the fish in this lake were haunted. You get all manner of absolutely inexplicable anomalies here. And it's not just non-white people, too. He describes the Oneida community, which is a group which had a very strange idea of sexuality, that sex was banned only, except with exceptions. That the old men, like the leader, John Noyes, had access to as many nubile actually just means marriageable, of a marriageable age women, as he wanted. But the young men were forced to have sex with postmenopausal women and to practice coitus reservatus. But this community managed to survive 2 generations before, as he says, other older men of perfection who had looked forward to their own right to initiate these girls were so annoyed that they reminded Noyes of the statutory rape laws of the state of New York, and he abruptly decamped for Canada. With his departure, the community collapsed. And of course, there is Duddy's Branch, an isolated hollow in eastern Kentucky, an example of people who are physically unwell and whose society and culture cannot easily be said to have served them well, but nevertheless survived and created a world of meaning to which they were committed. Now, these people lasted at least until the 1960s. The inhabitants of this remote mountain valley lived in a ramshackle wooden tar paper shacks along a 1-mile stretch of a polluted stream. Their houses had no indoor toilets, and only a few had functioning privies. Most people simply defecated on the ground, leaving their feces to be eaten by their emaciated dogs or be carried into the river by the frequent rains. In addition to human feces, the stream was polluted by all manner of garbage and waste that people threw into it. Nevertheless, it provided the people's only source of water. Except for a handful of men who were employed mostly in nearby coal mines, everyone lived on welfare. A few people had some chickens and small gardens, but the Duddies' branch's survival was dependent on grossly inadequate governmental food allowances. There was little protein available to them. In fact, there was little food of any kind, and most Duddies' branches were perpetually hungry. Their children were so malnourished that all were very thin and small. Some 6-year-olds had achieved only half the growth that is normal for children their age. Many were anemic, and all were chronically ill with endemic diseases. Their clothes were so filthy that, well, yes, with few exceptions, the housekeeping is shocking and the filth defies description. The air is foul with the stifling odor of dried urine, stale cooking, and unwashed bodies, dirty clothing. Although the people of Duddies branch tried to recognize kinship, their principal social tie was often difficult because sexual relations were indiscriminate. Girls began to have sexual intercourse as early as the age of 6, and illegitimate births were commonplace. Perhaps as a result, children had little interest in their identity of their fathers. When Gazaway asked one boy if he was not curious about his father, he answered, "Ain't worth knowing," a common sentiment. People were indifferent about marriage, and there were no community groups or formal organizations, not even a church. Indeed, there was very little sociality of any kind. But he describes this one tribe, the Bena of Highland of Papua New Guinea, as described by an anthropologist called Langness. Many Benamena quite clearly loved their children, and they sought to protect them against harm by making sure that they never visited neighboring villages where malevolent sorcerers were thought to live. Yet these same concerned parents allowed their small children to play with very sharp knives, sometimes cutting themselves, and they permitted them to sleep unattended next to the fire. As a result, a number of children burned themselves seriously. Langness reports that it was not uncommon to see children who had lost a toe to burns, and some were crippled by even more severe burns. A similarly non-rational and apparently maladaptive Bena practice concerned food. Although chemically short of protein, the Bena would eat neither chicken nor eggs because they said chickens ate feces. Yet their favorite food group, pigs, also ate feces. And, the primitive people of Africa. And we find many examples where, chiefdom, wealth, power is associated with progeny. This is not so. This is not necessarily so at all. This Hawaiian illustration shows that a few individuals can eradicate an unwanted or troublesome aspect of their culture, but these individuals were not ordinary people, but were chiefs, nobles, and priests, and people like these have been able to bring about social change. He mentions Shaka Zulu, the great Zulu chief, and yes, the rich and powerful may choose not to reproduce. For example, like some other despots, King Shaka Zulu refused to allow any of his possible offspring to live for fear that they would attempt to overthrow him. And although differently motivated, the wealthiest and most powerful members of modern society tend to have fewer children than lower class people. The Japanese elite did so over the past century, and as Barbara Miller has shown, during the 19th century, the high-ranking military and landowning castes of northern India killed all of their female offspring, even though they were more than affluent enough to raise daughters as well as sons. Rather than achieve reproductive success, they chose to reduce the numbers of children who could claim inheritance. And of course, this book was written before, the consequences of China's one-child policy came to me now. Of course, China decreed that families could have only one child because of overpopulation. With the result now, this is seriously maladaptive because the Chinese, like the Indians, routinely kill their unborn children for the sin of being female. So as a result, in China, there are hundreds of millions of men who are sexually superfluous. who have little to no chance of finding a wife. I've just scratched the surface of this book here. That's my highest recommendation, and I'm sure anyone who has the least bit of interest in the subject of anthropology and different cultures of the world will learn an enormous amount. So those are my thoughts on Robert Edgerton's Sick Societies. Coming up next week on the show, on Theater Thursday, I'm going to be discussing Robert Vienna's Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a silent film from 1920. On the book club, I am going to be discussing The Holy War by Nigel Cliff. And I'm going to be talking about what was Trip Hop on Music Monday this Monday, September the 20th. So that's it for this week. Thank you all for tuning in. And sorry for the screw up at the beginning. I learned a lesson there. Not to clear the cache after I have set up the stream. Live and learn. So I will be back on the air Monday at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show or any part of it, I appreciate it if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to make a donation to this live stream, thank you to those who have done so already. This would be greatly appreciated because I'm really quite up against it right now. My PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. If you're in Canada, donations may be made directly to the live stream via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.